Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Climate Resilience and Mitigation Seminar Series. I am the host and sponsor of this event. My name is Jim Gall. I'm a faculty member at the UW in Tacoma. And I don't want to take up too much of the speaker's time, so I'm going to introduce our speaker and let her take it away. Just want to let people know this seminar series is happening each Monday at 12:30. It's the same Zoom link that you have for this one, so hopefully you'll join us. It goes until the first Monday in December, so please come and check it all out and see what's being done in our region about climate change. So also, these are all being recorded, so if you miss one or you know somebody who wants to check this out afterwards, I will have these. I'm trying to find a place to host them, but if you need that link, I will have that available for you. You can just email me at jimgowel, JIMGAWEL @uw.edu, and I'd be happy to get it to you. All right, without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker. Nicole Fagan is a coastal management specialist with Washington Sea Grant at UW. She is trained as a land use and environmental planner and lawyer. Nicole engages in education, outreach, and research focused on social, economic, and environmental aspects of coastal adaptation and other waterfront issues. In the past 4 years, Nicole managed a portion of Washington's Coastal Resilience Project, working with local governments to enhance their resilience by introducing technical guidance for local planning and project purposes. Nicole holds a master's in city planning from MIT, my alma mater. It's great to have a fellow Beaver in the room, and a law degree from Northeastern University. So without further ado, Nicole, it's all yours.
Thank you. And you may wonder, so what does a big tent have to do with sea level rise and resilience? Well, let me tell you. The Washington Coastal Resilience Project is a great story about a very big tent and many diverse partners that you see here. Lots of partners. You have local governments, you have state agencies, you have nonprofits, you have individuals. And so all of these partners are part of the success of this story that I want to tell you about today that has to do with this Washington Coastal Resilience Project. Pros and cons to approach like this. Obviously, the pros and cons to working with that many people. But what I want to talk about and tell you today is about how we came up with technical innovations through this 4-year effort. We engaged with the community, state partnerships and programs. We've made products for different audiences. And the most important is when you go through something like this, what I want to close with, what are the lessons that you learned from working on a project like this? Okay, so first of all, to talk about introduction and background, and if I'm going to talk about coastal resilience, I'm going to start with just some real high level, what's the context? So what are you talking about? What does it mean when you're talking about coastal resilience? What's the problems that we're trying to solve? Well, Washington State, we're dealing with coastal flooding, and we have a lot of coastal erosion that is increasing. We have landslides for a lot of different reasons. We have tsunami potential, and not only tsunami here, but the impacts from tsunamis in other places. And then all of this is being exacerbated by sea level rise. So what I want to do is just take a step back and say, what are the basics of sea level rise? And for those of you who already know all of this, please bear with me. This is really very basic, just to make sure that we all are understanding what we're talking about. So the basics of it are that naturally you have heat entering the atmosphere, you have natural greenhouse gases, so you have the heat entering and then escaping. However, with greater amounts of greenhouse gas, it's getting trapped. The heat is getting trapped within the atmosphere, which is then warming our planet. So we're looking at increasing in temperatures. Here's the historical trend that you see with the black line. If we were to change the way that we are emitting greenhouse gases, we potentially over time could start to slow this trend. But if we just keep going the way we are going, this is the red line is the trend. So those temperature increases we're looking at could be as much as 5 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit by 2080. So what's the connection to oceans, you're saying? Okay, this is the real quick 101 on that. So when you're looking at heat influencing the ocean, there are two major factors. One is the melting of ice sheets. And you may have heard about Antarctica and Greenland are two of the places that we are looking at and watching to see what's the melting factor of these ice sheets, and then how's that going to affect the greenhouse, the increases of sea level rise. The second major factor is as the temperatures are warming, what's the ocean expanding? Thermal expansion. If you heat water, it will expand. So by how much and by when, all of these are factors that need to be considered. So we're looking at sea level rise, and we do see that there is changes of the sea levels in Washington that we're experiencing now. This is an example of tide gauge that you'll see. You could see in Washington a time frame of 1940 to 2020, where there's just this constant upward trend. So what was the need for the Coastal Resilience Project? Okay, given the sea level rise background. In 2014, we conducted a report on planning for climate change. So at that time, and that's not that long ago, 7 years ago, but we're looking at a lot of scientific information, technical breakthroughs on climate. But most of it was really focused on the mitigation. How can we slow greenhouse gas? And very little was being done on adaptation and adaptive capacity. So we did the survey of practitioners, community leaders, planners, and we asked them what are the barriers to taking action. And so the blue line you see here, and this is what this really demonstrates, is the difference between this is an issue of importance. We see it as an issue of importance for people who ask, but then also the red is this is where we think how much information we think we have to be able to start addressing these issues. So we asked it about a whole bunch of different issues: shoreline change, economic viability, costs of adaptation, social vulnerability, and specifically, we looked at sea level rise and saw there was this gap. So the blue being, yes, we think this is an issue of importance, and the red being, do you think you've got what you need? And that's a huge, significant gap between there. So the project that we designed to get at that action gap was a coastal resilience grant from NOAA. Washington Coastal Resilience Project came out of that. So in 2016, we said our goal is to rapidly increase the capacity to build resilience in Washington State. So with the grant, we identified 4 objectives that we wanted to be dealing with. So the first is filling critical information gaps and better communicate risk. Second objective was to leverage existing policies and programs. Third was to learn by doing, to work with 3 communities with pilot projects. And then the fourth was to use targeted outreach to motivate community action. So when we set up this grant and started in, we thought, well, this is very linear and logical. We just go step by step, and we'll just go through all of these one by one. And we stitched them together and figured that we would be able to accomplish part 1 and moving to part 2, et cetera. But really what happened was this very complicated, very non-linear and very adaptive conversation with the community and with all of our partners about how to make this work. And so we would start with, for example, analysis, and we'd create something from the technical side. We'd take it to the communities, our pilot communities. They would give us feedback, which then was a do loop back to, no, we didn't quite have it right. We needed to do something different. So we would start back to number 1 and we'd revise. We'd then go into other areas with, for example, working with state policy. They would say, we need information that we didn't think about when we started objective 1. So each of these became this more iterative process. And that's what I want to tell you about, is how we did this and all the different pieces. And I'm going to talk about 5 innovations. So the first innovation that we came up with is technical innovations to support sea level rise. And for these 5 innovations that are technical innovations, it really wouldn't have been possible if it hadn't been this amazing collaboration between science and local governments and different universities and USGS and all of the different partners in this. So the first innovation is talking about a probabilistic framework for sea level rise assessments. Okay, the idea is this is based on the concept that up until this point, when we talk about sea level rise, we would say we should plan for 3 feet of sea level rise by a given date, or 4 feet or 2 feet. People didn't know how much to plan for, by what time, what probability there was that it was going to really reach that level. So what we did is started with a model created by Dr. Kopp, who is with Rutgers University. And he came up with this probabilistic model that talks about time frame. So for different time frames, you can then come up with different probabilities of how much sea level rise, what the magnitude might be. So a 99% magnitude means it's really high. A 99 probability, 99% would be a very high probability that sea level rise would be at a certain level and a certain magnitude, as compared to a 0.1%, very low probability that sea level rise. And then if you look at this on this other y-axis here, this is in feet, the potential magnitude. And so as you can see, the 0.1%, a very, very high probability, it will not exceed 8 feet. That's one way, or to say it's a very low chance that it'll ever be 0.1% at 8 feet, but it's possible. Similarly, a very high probability that we could be seeing a little over almost a foot of sea level rise by 2100. So it was giving a lot more range of options of how to look at sea level rise. Second innovation, and this is interesting because this is about Washington State, that we have what's called uplift and subsidence. So on the outer coast, we have the land doing some uplift due to tectonic plates. We have then subsidence in areas of Puget Sound. That hadn't been taken into consideration at all with any of the sea level rise projections that have been put in place prior to this time. So the new projections that we created took into account those projections and included the localized vertical land movement. This third innovation was really creating a whole range of products and analyses and putting them in one place so that everybody could gain access to do this planning. And this addressed a real gap in having the tools and products for communities to be using in their planning processes. And all of this is on the Coastal Hazard Resilience Network, and this is the website. If you just Google Coastal Hazard Resilience Network, you can find that. And then there's a tab for sea level rise. Okay, the fourth innovation was sea level rise projections, not for just generally for the state, but at 170 specific locations along the entire coast. And each of these, and this graphic here shows, you can see this on the website, each of these little bubbles and circles are a different location and have its own unique downloadable Excel spreadsheet. However, that led to innovation number 5, or not, which was when you downloaded the spreadsheet, you got this very complicated spreadsheet that people would take a look at and found that it was really difficult to understand. You had the probabilities, you had the time frames, you could then look at the magnitude, but trying to explain that became really, really complicated. So that was the need for a solution for problems that we had created with innovation number 5. And that led to the creation of the interactive sea level rise data visualization I'm going to show you in a minute. It was created by the Climate Impacts Group and Tableau partnering, recognizing we needed something online, more user-friendly, that could help us get to that same understanding of what are the range of options of sea level rise that you might be looking at in this table. And as you can see, it can range from 0 magnitude all the way up to anywhere to 18 feet, and these are all in feet. So how do you show that in a different way that's more user-friendly? So this shows you a solution for that, and looking at projected sea level changes that you can select. First of all, you click on, and if you go to the website, you can see this and play around with it later. You click on a location, and then you select this likelihood, and this is risk. You can compare how risk averse are you. Then you can select which of the different greenhouse gas scenarios, because depending on whether you're using a greenhouse gas scenario of 8.5, which is kind of business as usual, or what's called RCP 4.5, which would be we're really pulling back on our greenhouse gas emissions, you're going to get different results, especially beyond the year 2050. So you can select the different greenhouse gas scenarios. You can also select what the time frame is that you want to look at the projections for, and then it will create for you this whole scenario that gives you the graph, and then it also gives you the table so you can look at the specifics of what the magnitude of sea level rise would be for a specific time frame. You can then also do this by starting with time frame and the amount of sea level rise you're concerned about seeing, and see what's the probability that it's going to be, you're going to have that amount of sea level rise at a certain time. So this was a very useful tool that was created. So once you've got these tools, though, then the question is, how do you communicate that and engage with the community? So we identified 2 specific communities, and in this case, CAMANO, WHIDBEY Island County was one of our partners, but the other was Tacoma. And we chose these 2 communities to be very specific of looking at what their needs were for sea level rise work and the kinds of issues they had. One was with Island County because it's smaller communities and it was more residential. And then the other was looking at Tacoma, which had a very industrial community and a large port, and it gave us a chance to look at very different things. So we went to each of the communities first and said, what do you want to address, or what do you think you need in terms of addressing sea level rise and resilience for your community, and what's the problem that you want to start looking at? So I'm just going to give you a few of the examples of what we did with these 2 communities. My role in this project was working with these 2 communities in these pilot projects, and I would interface with the science team that was putting together the projections that I showed you before. So here's some examples. And the first one, for those of you who are in Tacoma, you'll recognize Owens Beach. This is, at the time, the city metro parks had already started on a process of redesigning and upgrading the beach park. What they found was this whole area, the water, grass area would get inundated, and they were having more and more storms that they were facing. And so they were looking at, what do we do about that? How do we redesign this whole parking area, the stormwater, et cetera? And they got wind of us starting this project on the resilience project and put a halt to the planning and said, wait, before we go any farther, let's try to consider, what does sea level rise have to do with the planning? So we wrote out projections. What you see are some lines here of projected sea levels out into the future. And based on this information that we provided them, they took a step back and said, we need to redesign our project. And so they completely redid what they thought what the redesign was going to be, taking into consideration that if they needed to think about 30 to 50 years down the line, they needed to be thinking about sea level rise. Another one, Tacoma, is this waterfront park along Ruston Way. And wanting to understand, at this time, the city was engaged in the visioning for this whole linear park. And they said, how do we take into consideration sea level rise in that whole process? So working with the team, We examined not only sea level rise, but storm surge and wave impacts. And this was an initial graph. This graphic shows an initial effort to look at wave and storm impacts and how that might be incorporated into the planning process. And this kind of modeling was a precursor for what's being done now, which is creating this coastal storm modeling tool for the entire Puget Sound region that we believe is going to be a wonderful tool and a really useful tool to help communities in their coastal planning, trying to decide how to develop their infrastructure and their waterfronts. And then another thing in Tacoma was infrastructure planning. And again, here you had this major port facility. So at the time, the city was saying we're going to be doing infrastructure. We're going to be doing a sub-area plan for the tide flats, and we want to consider sea level rise. So what we were able to do is provide them with some basic information about sea level rise. They could start mapping it, and then they were able to incorporate all of that into the whole process of sub-area planning, which is going on as we speak today, and incorporates the sea level rise. As I said, Island County was very different, and their needs were very different, much more rural, and their focus, they told us, was they really wanted to focus on developing tools for the local governments and for their staff at the county to communicate about sea level rise. And how do you communicate with this about sea level rise to the public? How can you address restoration issues? And then things about how can you address sea level rise in the Shoreline Master Program, which, for those who are not familiar with it, that's our Washington State. It's a coastal program to address development along the shoreline. So one of the things that we did with Island County was come up with this community-based coastal resilience planning guide. And in it, it's like a textbook that has a whole range of ways and worksheets and techniques to work with the communities and help them thinking about how are they vulnerable, what are their vulnerabilities, then how are they going to be able, what should they do for planning, how should they be thinking about it, what are some of the adaptation measures they might want to consider, and what's that going to mean to them as a community. So then the other thing that we found was that in both the case of Tacoma and Island County, that they had a number of restoration projects already going, and they wanted to know, well, so what's sea level rise going to do with respect to these projects in the light of sea level rise? And we then also had another partner in this project, which is the Estuary and Salmon Recovery Program, which is part of Department of Fish and Wildlife in Washington. And they wanted to be part of this effort as well. So we banded together to look at this effort of planning, designing, and maintaining restoration projects in Puget Sound, and came up with a guide it's not a guidebook, it's a whole series of considerations. What do you need to consider if you are thinking of a nearshore restoration project in Puget Sound? So we also wanted to learn what we could from non-technical audiences, such as community members who are already engaged in planning and project development. How could they add to what we were learning? What could we provide them? What were their needs? There was a whole series of workshops throughout the whole time that we were working on this project, and continues now on working with these community members. And it really helped jumpstart a lot of work that's going on now, particularly out on the coast, but also within Puget Sound, the inner Puget Sound area. Okay, so as I said, this was a really big tent of partners and doing research and outreach and education. And a very important partner in all of this was the state of Washington through their Department of Ecology. And the team spearheaded a number of significant efforts that were related to new partnerships and programs that had not previously existed at the state level. So one of the things in particular relates to, as I was explaining, this Shoreline Master Program. It's implemented at the local level. like a local plan, but the state sets the statewide guidance for what the local jurisdictions are going to do. So Ecology had already come up with, it's called Appendix A. This is before we started our Washington Coastal Resilience Project. They had developed initial guidance because they were hearing that some of the communities wanted to start addressing sea level rise. So they looked at, well, they had put together this guidance that said, here's some things we think you might want to consider. Well, once we started into our work with the Resilience Project, they said, let's look at what's been done. Have any communities addressed sea level rise in their programs? If so, what kind of way have they addressed it? What are they doing? What do they need? So very recently, and this is just this summer, Ecology came out with this great report, which is lessons learned from local governments that have been trying to incorporate sea level rise into their shoreline master programs. And it really looks at successful strategies and some of the challenges, the needs, opportunities, and it really builds off of what we did throughout the Coastal Resilience Project that then pushes these shoreline master programs that next step and gives them the opportunity to start really trying to address sea level rise in their programs. Then another significant statewide effort that was led by Ecology addressed how different state agencies are incorporating sea level rise into their capital grant programs. And so why this is important is that a lot of times the grants are being given to local governments as a way to, and can have criteria in it that then pushes the local government to design and use information like sea level rise in their projects. So it's encouraging and influencing that whole process of local infrastructure and really being to ensure that things are being designed so they're really addressing some of the challenges that we're going to be facing in the future. And this leads me then to talking about, well, so what products did we produce and who was the audience that we were producing it for? So as you can see, this is the audience. It's a really big group of people and a lot of different needs and coming from different different perspectives. So what products did we produce for all of these folks? We tried to tag needs to what we produced and what we were hearing people needed. So we came up with data training workshops, information sharing workshops, personal conversations to help support communities, booklets with information, maps with projections, talking points for the community, descriptions about why data matters, help with the Shoreline Master Program guidance, field mapping, future data access, and experts coming to talk. And all of this was done with the idea of making sure that we were making this information as available, as widely available as we could, which then brings us to how do you do that? And again, this is the Coastal Hazard Resilience Network, WashingtonCoastalNetwork.com. All of this information now is available in one place on the website, and this is managed by the Department of Ecology and Washington Sea Grant. And it's trying to address this idea of there's a hurdle of getting regional collaboration, getting everybody to be applying the same information in a context at the same time in one way and having the information in one place. For example, this how to choose. This is taking this table that I showed you, this spreadsheet. We created a document that really tries to break that apart and explain what are we talking about when we're talking about these sea level rise projections, not what is sea level rise. That's another document, but this is how do you use this information and make a choice about what you should select. We also created a video, and this is also on the website, of how to use these numbers. This is Crystal Raymond from Climate Impact Groups, who's talking about how to use this information. Also, this is where you see the sea level rise you can find the sea level rise for the nearshore restoration, guidelines for mapping sea level rise inundation. And then also this is the Coastal Hazards Risk Reduction Project Mapper. And it gives these case studies. So you'll see all of these different locations for each one. If you click on it, it gives you case study information that for all these different projects where people are doing adaptation work just throughout this whole region. So when you do something like this, question is, what are some of the lessons learned? So I'm just going to leave you with 5 of the lessons that we took away from the 3 to 4 years of work that we did on this project. First is, you need to break communications down to really simple components so that everybody can understand what you're talking about. And that was really clear when we started talking about sea level rise and projections and probabilities. We really needed to come up with a way to talk about it in a way that everybody understood, which then leads to lesson number 2, which science needs to be translated. And for all of you who are going into scientific fields, is understanding that there's a disconnect between a community member and a scientist, and there's really important information to be translated to the community members that they need. And so we need to be thinking about, how are we making this information available? Are we making it translating it into language that a broader group of people community can really understand? The third lesson is tie immediate needs to long-term visions. So when we talk with people in the community, they would talk about, this is what we need right now. And this is the things we're experiencing right now. And that's great to talk about needs right now. Yet you need to tie it to the future and make sure that you're explaining those long-term ideas, because for a lot of community members, sea level rise was way out in the future, whereas they had these very immediate issues. And so it'd be starting with those immediate problems. For example, are you experiencing flooding right now in your neighborhood? If so, let's talk about how that might get worse. That's how you tie immediate issues to those long-term visions. Lesson 4 is communities need the training and guidance. I can't say this enough about just making the information available. It was like people were dying to get the information and we just couldn't get it out there fast enough. And that's still the case. Again, having the website is really useful, but creating webinars and having workshops, all of this is so critical to being able to get this information out there. And then lesson number 5 really is pretty self-evident, which is it's about the relationships. It's about how we work together. We started with the long conversations, which led to relationships that created the project in the first place. And then the project has created all these other relationships that we're working together, that we're creating ways that we can better support community leaders, and the leaders then can be better support to their communities. So it's just broadening everything that we're doing. So it's just a much more fruitful and locally organized efforts that we're at the beginnings of. So ultimately, it's really, and bottom line, it's about the outcomes that matter. And this graph just shows the range of places in which different locations throughout the region that are using the results from the Coastal Resilience Project. And these are only the ones we know for sure. So you have examples where people are integrating it into planning, whether it's state efforts or local plans. Then also regional research and technical efforts that are going on to continue the work that was started as part of this or had been ongoing, and it's accessing and enhancing research that's going on. So bottom line, back to it, it takes a very big tent. It was a very big tent, and the results are really continuing to magnify themselves to really build resilience throughout our community. And with that, thank you very much. And I am happy to try to take and answer questions as best I possibly can.
Thank you very much, Nicole. That was wonderful. Sorry, I've got an echo here. Hang on a second. All right, let's try that again. Okay, so my folks, if you have questions, please chat them in the room. That would be great. We have one question already. Has there been any pushback or resistance in certain communities to receiving this information? If so, how is that being handled?
That's a great question. And that's the one that we started with, and that's about the communication issue. And absolutely. I'm going to give a great example of working with Island County, where we first approached the commissioners and said, we want to talk about sea level rise. And we had been told they were very dubious and they were not sure they wanted to even engage in this effort for us. And we met with them one-on-one. We laid out maps. We walked through what information we developed and what we were putting together. And by the end of the project, the commissioners were our biggest supporters. It really emphasizes how you have to, and this gets back to what was my number one or number two lessons, is break things down to things that are simple so that people understand what you're talking about and don't hit everybody with crisis, whatever. It's try to make the information available in a way that people understand it and bring people along. So yes, that's out there. And yes, there are ways that you can address that.
Question from a student. Do you have any coordination with FEMA or other federal agencies about these potential sea level rises of any sort?
Yes, thank you. Great question about FEMA. So just for those who follow FEMA mapping, one of the things is that a lot of the FEMA mapping that we look at, that is used to look at flooding, does not look forward into and address and take into consideration sea level rise. It's retrospective historical flooding is what the FEMA maps are based on. So FEMA has been part of the conversations all along, and they've been aware of it, and they've been in all the trainings, and there's a lot of work that's been done in collaboration with FEMA. And it's really important that people understand these different agencies and the information that they provide and how they work together. And then also just going forward, how we're working together with FEMA and how they can be using this information here in Washington State and information about sea level rise in other states.
A question from a student about, are these resources in other languages, but kind of a tie on to that, what kind of efforts did you have beforehand or in your part of your planning process in reaching communities of color or communities where English is a second language?
That's a great question. And that's something that definitely I think is lacking, in that we don't have it translated, and what's available on the website is only in English. That said, working with communities of color, working with different communities, we've done a lot of work. Well, working with the tribal community, they've been a partner all along. And in fact, I would say some of the most proactive work in Washington State has been with the tribal communities of Washington. They've done some of the best work, and they've incorporated our work. So that was a close collaboration throughout, and continues to be. They've been leading us oftentimes, and we've been working with them. So there's some great work that's out there with that. Other communities of color and the impacts is an interesting question, because when you think about coastal impacts in Washington as compared to, say, for example, Louisiana, or even the Bay Area, where you might have communities of color that's not tribal related, indigenous, we're talking other communities of color, and the communities here, except for example, in Washington, in Seattle, where you have the Duwamish, the property owners it's pretty much white people who own property. And so those are the property owners. So recognizing that, the work in the Duwamish, our work is being, in fact, we're just part of a new project that's taking place on the Duwamish. And so that area is probably one of the largest communities of color. And then other than that, I think the issue of thinking about communities of color and underrepresented communities is thinking about infrastructure. And we underestimate how much that is important. For example, in talking about planning for the tide flats and doing a sub-area plan and thinking about sea level rise, who works there and how do they get there and how do they get home from there? That's been part of the conversation that we've played a role in making sure is being addressed as this Tide Flats project has been going on. And I know Tacoma has really taken that into consideration. So I think what we did is created a framework for information to be used in a lot of different ways that are addressing a lot of different issues for a wide range of the communities.
Another question, I was wondering what a successful outcome from applying your resilience ideas to a project might look like, and maybe do you have any specific ideas on how Owens Beach plans were changed as a result of their work in Tacoma?
Yeah, great question. And a couple of examples that are, project related, and the others that are policy related. Well, Owen Beach, the design changes that they put into place, as I remember, and I probably would have to dig up the plan, what they changed from beginning to end, but one was that they really moved back infrastructure. Some of it they weren't able to, but a lot of it they could move back the parking, and they created areas that they knew were going to flood, and so they designed it to allow for that flooding to take place. And that's part of a lot of what this information has been used for. Similarly, there's a beach project on CAMANO Island, and they incorporated all these sea level rise projections, and state parks actually has been a real, if you will call it a super user of these sea level rise projections and this information in looking at state parks. And they've been redesigning parks, going through them and the ones along the coast, and saying, how do we take this into consideration? How do we move the major infrastructure back or elevate it? What needs to be in front? What can get wet? What do we know it's okay to lose? And that's part of this risk assessment, is you're assessing on your site. How do I look at the site to what can, if it's going to be inundated, that it's okay? For example, a beach path in Owen Beach, so they were saying, okay, if the beach path gets inundated in 20 years, what's the cost to replace that? Versus we're going to build a building and it's going to be inundated in 20 years. Well, maybe we want to think about moving that out of the way. And then similarly, the policy kinds of things, like I said, the shoreline master program, some of these communities are changing their the base flood elevation for housing, for buildings along the coast based on this information. And they're looking at potentially coastal hazard areas and putting in special planning techniques and requirements, because now they have more information that they can build on that we really didn't have as much specificity before.
I don't see any more questions. I had one follow-up. So my follow-up was, it seems to me that a lot of the population, you mentioned that a lot of the homeowners and things near the coastal areas that might be inundated tend to be white and more affluent, which I can understand since I can't afford to live there for sure. But I was wondering about parks. You mentioned Owens Beach, but I'm thinking more along the population that uses the shorefront for respite on hot days, or for recreation, or for fishing. Has anybody used your work yet for projects along those lines?
That's exactly where I think it's going to be local governments. Like if it's not state parks, then if it's a county park or a city park, or which is mainly what it is. But the other ones are, so where there are, that's where putting it into the guidelines, for example, I'm trying to think of a good example of you need to do renovation for a pier that's a fishing pier, or you need to do update on a community beach that is local government. They have to abide by the shoreline master program for that community. So what does it say about sea level rise? And that's part of this, getting this information out into these programs and into the regulations. That's one thing. And then the other is the grants side I was talking about, is if RCO, the state grant office, recreation office, if they are saying sea level rise is a criteria that you need to consider in your projects, then that starts having this effect on all these people who are applying for grants, because then they know that they have to be incorporating it. And so I can't list off the names of them, but I know that that is a significant change that over the last 5 years, 6 years, that the expectation that sea level rise is being addressed in these projects that are grant based. So that's, I think, really the way that you can get at your point, which is how do you make these things start to happen? And so we've been looking at it all these different ways, but I think those are a couple of examples of ways that I know we're starting to see some of these things happen for more public access.
Last question, I think. You mentioned realtors as one of the groups that you had worked with, and I was wondering, is there a reporting tool that, or something that home buyers could use to actually figure that from your work that makes it easy for them to tell whether what they're going to buy could potentially be inundated in 20 years or so?
Right now, realtors aren't, for example, offering that information. I know there are states that are considering that it actually would be one of the, like you have the checklist, a homeowner, when they're buying the property, to know what's the future condition. Right now, we don't have that in Washington State. It's a great idea, and it's something that we've actually talked about. Wouldn't it be great to have that? So where do you find that information? And then that's where you go back to the local government, or, for example, a homeowner can get access to sea level rise projections that are available to anybody, and they can look at them for where they live. We don't have the exact tools yet that makes it really easy. NOAA does have a sea level rise viewer. You can Google NOAA sea level rise viewer, and you can zoom in fairly specifically to your property and see what's it going to look like in 50 years, what is it going to look like in 100 years. So that gives people, there's a beginning point to start looking at what can we be expecting. And I think that we're going to see more and more of that homeowners are going to be asking those questions of what's the future of this property. So I think it's happening.